Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for staying with us all day. I'm Cory Welt, Associate Director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. And I'm pleased to open this panel on COT, which we've called COT in the EU-Russia Crossfire, Belarus and the Caucasus, with three excellent presentations on three of the states that are common neighbors of the European Union and Russia, Belarus, Georgia, and Armenia, all somewhat different, all presentations with somewhat different takes on the efforts of the three states to strike a balance in their relations with Russia and the West. And we'll start not in the order of the agenda, but we'll open with Arkady Moshes from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. Can EU-Belarus relations be reset? Arkady.
Is this on? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much, Cory. It's a pleasure to be here. As always, let me thank all of you for your interest to this panel on my own behalf. And I will try indeed to speak about the current developments in the European-Belarusian relations and basically the pretty systematic attempts by the European Union to reset the relations with Belarus. There's a systematic talk about the need to re-engage that is done by a number of experts, mostly in Europe, but here in the US as well. Actually, if you read the Eurasia Daily Monitor, you'll find a lot of that on the pages of this media. And the talk implies basically, the argument goes on to say that, Belarus is isolated, and this is pretty much not only a mistake of the West, but this is something that the West has to be kind of blamed for, and now it has to be changed. And there is already a respective policy. There is this kind of process of intensifying contacts, lifting even sanctions. 24 officials, former leading officials of the Belarusian regimes, have been recently this summer taken off the sanction list. The logic was very awkward, because basically people were arguing that they're no longer in their offices, as if they could be changing the office can be a reason for absolving people of the responsibility for abusing the office when they were in office. But nevertheless, that's the fact. I'm arguing that we will soon see a full reset, suspension of the sanctions probably, which in reality will be a capitulation of the European Union and a huge diplomatic victory of Minsk. Because Minsk will get everything it wants. It will get the international legitimization of the system for the first time in 19 years probably. And it will not have to do much, either in terms of the domestic changes or in terms of real changes in its foreign policy. So why is the EU now interested in moving away from its earlier norm-based approach towards Belarus and adopting something different? There are four reasons. Well, there are probably more, because I take even the real economic reasons and the lobbying done, especially by some neighbors of Belarus, aside. But there are four reasons that you can clearly see when you deal with the European bureaucrats or read the analytical papers that are produced around this issue. The first and the major one is geopolitical. There's a clear argument that Mr. Lukashenko has to be rewarded for the fact that he refused to fully solidarize with the Russian policy on Ukraine. And that he has to be helped to keep his distance from Moscow, that he has to be helped to increase his maneuvering space vis-à-vis Moscow. The second reason is the genuine frustration with the results or no results of this exactly previous approach, which was human rights and political freedom focused, But basically, the logic is not convincing at all, but this is nevertheless the logic that exists, and the logic goes as, okay, this approach failed, we've got to do something else. Well, lifting the sanctions is something else, why don't we do that? It exactly fits the description. In more details, that means the EU argues that it has to interact not only with the opposition, but also with the representatives of the regime, especially the technocratic part of the regime, hoping that gradually these people will be socialized kind of into European discourse, and at least from the technical point of view, the way Belarus is governed will become more compatible with the way the modern Europe is governed. That's a typical technocratic approach. The third reason is the crisis of the EU neighbourhood policy. The EU, I would say, implicitly and sometimes even explicitly admits that both in the east and in the south they're having problems, and this whole policy is now under review. And when it comes to the east at least, but probably more generally, the key concept that tells you exactly how this policy has to be changed is called co-ownership. So the reasons, the way they diagnose the failures of the previous approach is that, okay, we were trying to impose something on the partners, they didn't like it, that's why they didn't do it. So in order to make them like what we want them to do, they need to co-own the initiative. In practice, that means that the partners are expected to drive the policy of the European Union. So the partners come up with the list of wishes, and to the extent the EU can positively reply to those demands, that will exactly create the field within which the policy will develop. These are the three more important reasons. And the fourth is at the moment least important, but it's also pretty technocratic. There is an idea according to which interaction with Belarus and with Kazakhstan, with Russia's partners in the Eurasian Economic Union, can actually facilitate interaction with the whole body. There's still some fantasizers who believe that the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union can launch the process of negotiating a real free trade area from Lisbon to Vladivostok, and then Russia is expected to be more demanding as always, but Russia's partners are expected to be less demanding and be able to influence Russia's position. I mean, you hear less about that right at the moment, but 6-8 months back, you would hear a lot of these conversations in Brussels. Then there is also an expectation of that now Minsk would be more open to the EU's overtures. And again, there are basically two reasons. First, EU believes that the Minsk regime is now pretty much concerned with what Russia has done and is doing vis-à-vis Ukraine, that it's concerned about keeping the sovereignty, and that's why it is interested to actually play its balancing act maybe more vigorously than it has been doing in the previous years. And the second reason is that the economic crisis is there. Russian economic slowdown is a challenge. Russia is less willing and less able to provide significant economic resources and funding to Belarus. Therefore, Minsk might be interested in the access to the funding that could come from the international financial institutions, and therefore it should be more willing to reciprocate. So this is a well thought through concept. There's only one problem with it. It's totally hypothetical and has very little to do with the reality. And it's actually wishful thinking. Because when you look at what Belarusian government has been doing over the last 15 months, or actually 18 months, since the start of the crisis in Crimea, you will see the following. Well, first, there's practically nothing, or very little, I would say, up until recently, nothing, now very little, that would be happening domestically and indicate that liberalization might be forthcoming. You have now the case of the release of 6 political prisoners last month, but basically this was done in a very, I would say, awkward even manner. But the point is that the presidential campaign, which is now going on in Belarus, up until now, has been less free and less pluralist than the campaigns of 2010 and 2006. That even the release of the prisoners happened only after the registration of candidates was completed, and that was made intentionally because otherwise one of the prisoners, who was the most popular opposition politician and the only candidate to become a single candidate of the whole opposition, so he could not be registered. Well, let alone the fact that the EU's original demands were that the prisoners should not only be released, but they should be rehabilitated. Now they received presidential pardon, but they remain convicted criminals, so they cannot even participate in the elections. So on the domestic front, very little. On the diplomatic front, well, there are all sorts of talks and conversations and gestures, but what matters in the end is the legal position. And the legal position is that Belarus refused, pretty bluntly, to condemn Russia for the annexation of Crimea. It refused to do it in the UN vote, in the General Assembly vote in March 2014, and in May 2015, this year, it once again confirmed its position at the EAP, Eastern Partnership Summit in Riga, and everybody who was following the summit knows that it was primarily the position of Belarus and also of Armenia, which basically made the joint declaration of the summit meaningless on this point. But there is no joint declaration on this point. The declaration says that the sides simply confirm the positions taken previously. The official rhetoric of the Belarusian leadership is that they remain Russia's most important partner, and Mr. Lukashenko himself, in his address to the nation in April last year, he said that those people in the West who rushed to interpret his absence on the Victory Day parade in Moscow as a sign of solidarity with the West are idiots and stupids. He basically used words that foolishness and stupidity were the exact wording that he used. So he's not doing anything that the West would want him to do. And there are reasons for that. And again, the reasons are very fundamental. One, Belarus is not a neutral country, but Russia's closest military security ally. And it was recently again reminded that it's Russia's military ally. Early this month, the Russian government decided to remind Lukashenko that Russia wants to establish a new Air Force base in Belarus. And this is most likely going to happen, even though the public position of the Belarusian government has been that it is not interested in hosting this base. But I don't think it has a choice. It has little choice. It does not have full economic sovereignty on a number of economic issues, which is the result of its membership in the Eurasian Economic Union. It's totally dependent on Russian subsidies. Only the energy subsidies go up to 15% of Belarusian GDP. And if you add credits and loans, the literature at least has a kind of a consensus that up to 20% of Belarusian GDP is Russian subsidies. And EU has no capacity, no willingness to replace Russia as a donor, as a funder of Belarus. Belarus or Minsk and Moscow rather, they're very suspicious. They are together, and they're both suspicious about the genuine motivations of the West. There will be no trust in this relationship because there is an assumption that the West must be interested in the regime change. And last but not least, Russia has a colossal soft power in Belarus at the moment. And this is something which is worth really exploring. For instance, I'll give you only one figure. And it's not surprising because Belarusians take most of their information from the Russian media still. And I mean, according to the June polls, 62% of respondents considered Russia's annexation of Crimea as a restoration of historical justice, whereas only 22% thought this was an imperialist takeover and occupation. So the population is on that matter more pro-Russian, and in that sense quite different from Lukashenko and from the image that Lukashenko is trying to project. And that explains why Russia is absolutely not nervous witnessing what's happening between Belarus and the EU. Mr. Lavrov even said that, the normalization in relations between the EU and Belarus has always been in Russia's interests. And this is clear because the analysis shows that this is not going to be anything serious, that Russia keeps the full control over the Belarusian foreign policy, and this is how it's going to stay. So I would argue that if the EU really wanted to achieve a reset in the EU-Belarusian relations, it would have to understand that this could only happen if Minsk launched the true process of reforms. Otherwise, the maximum that can be expected is some kind of a technocratic dialogue for the EU and the full legitimization of the system of governance that has been created in Belarus before. And as I said, this will be a very good diplomatic victory for Minsk and an obvious diplomatic defeat for the EU. But that's nevertheless is most likely going to happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Arkady. Now we'll turn to Andrey Makarychev from the University of Tartu, and we'll turn toward the Caucasus with a presentation on Tête-à-tête with the Kremlin, Georgia's insecure identity vis-à-vis Russia's soft power.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit poetic, but first of all, thank you to Arkady for helping me with linking his presentation to mine, because now I know what we have in common. It's soft power, and it's different interpretations of soft power as seen from Russian and this time Georgian perspective. And I have to say that this presentation is based on field research which I conducted as part of a larger international project in Tbilisi this summer, with the idea of trying to understand how the Russian resources of soft power, how they are being understood, how they work in the Georgian context. And the starting point for this analysis was something which is more or less widely known from any even superficial analysis of Western media, and this is about the eventual erosion of the pro-Western consensus in Georgia. It's about creation of a coalition of newly emerged pro-Eurasian NGOs in Georgia, plus Georgian Orthodox Church, plus groups of local Russia sympathizers, etc., etc. And this is also constitutes a very important dynamics against the background of Western inaction in Georgia. So this is a story which is more or less known and which can serve as a starting point for understanding how Russia tries to exercise its soft power. My findings are a little bit different from this picture. But I will more specifically focus on conclusion on my conclusions at the end of the presentation. I will start with asking a question of how unified is Russian position versus Georgia, and how many or how diverse is the Russian discourse in general. I would just very briefly mention that there are two fractions within Russian foreign policy community. One, I would call them geopolitical realists who would claim that Russia acts as a classical hegemonic power which safeguards its interests, and that's in fact the story of geopolitical realists. What is interesting is that there is a kind of alternative discourse in the Russian foreign policy community. And I would call those people normative crusaders. Those who would say that Russia is not motivated by material gains or material interests. Russia is more interested in supporting justice, whatever is understood by justice, and Russia acts more on normative issues or normative principles rather than on material gain seeking. But in the meantime, these two positions, while they do coexist with each other, but in the meantime, what is interesting is that they share a number of common points, starting with legal points, legal issues. Russia is legal successor of the Soviet Union. Then it also includes the Russian role of peacekeeper in the South Caucasus. Then this discourse also includes an idea that Russia invested in preserving and helping Georgia with territorial integrity, for example, sanctioning Abkhazia for several years, etc., etc. So there are many arguments that Russian kind of soft power discourse tries to incorporate into this logic, which also includes references to the role of Evgeny Primakov in 1997 and his role of mediation between the head of secessionist Abkhazia and the president of Georgia, Shevardnadze. That's according to Primakov's memoirs, etc. What is interesting here is Russia, in my view, completely failed to transform these arguments into more or less consistent narrative that would be appealing to the Georgian elites. And this is the weakest point in Russian soft power projection in Georgia. But in the meantime, there are just a number of channels or a number of institutional links that Russia uses for projecting its soft power in Georgia. And I will just briefly enumerate each of them and discuss how strong are those channels. The first is more or less formal or semi-formal. That's well-known Abashidze-Karasin format or platform, which is used as from the Russian side as a confirmation for the goodwill and the intentions to keep in touch with the Georgian elite, even in the conditions of broken diplomatic relations between the two countries. The most, I would say, vulnerable points, well, there are two of them in this kind of semi-official type of dialogue between the two countries. First of all, and it's well known that Russia refuses to recognize itself as a part of the conflict or in the conflict. And this, of course, creates a great deal of controversy in many respects. And the second point is that Russia tries to a certain extent, play with uncertainty in dealing with or in communicating with the Georgian elite. I'll just give you one quotation from Georgi Tarasin. And this runs, in my view, kind of or contradicts the rigid Russian position of recognition of independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. That's what he said. The crucial thing is to convince Abkhazians and South Ossetians that they would be better off to live in a confederation with Georgia as opposed to living on their own. Should this be once attained, this would be an absolutely new political situation. That's what's said by the Russian envoy to this common dialogue. And I think it's an interesting point because it contains a little bit again of controversy and makes Russian position a little bit, I would say, uncertain. Then the channel number two is religious diplomacy, and again we all know about Russian Orthodox Church, which plays an important role in the continuing dialogue with Georgia. We know that the key point here is the recognition from the part of the Russian Orthodox Church of the canonical integrity of the integrity of canonical territory of Georgian Orthodox Church, which of course has to be interpreted as a very clear political gesture. And generally speaking, what comes from our interviews is that Russian Orthodox Church is very much disinterested in officially reconsidering or changing the official borders between Russia and Georgia, and is much keener on keeping relations with Georgia rather than with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The interesting point here is that the Georgian Orthodox Church is a very controversial institution. It can simultaneously support European integration of Georgia, and in the same time can incorporate sympathies to pro-Stalinist groups. Ilya II is critical of Russian policy in the occupied territories on the one hand, and on the other hand he meets with famous bikers club Night Wolves, which is clearly Kremlin's project, etc., etc. So there is a great deal of controversy in the political profile of the Georgian Orthodox Church itself, and of course, as in each and any social institutions, you can find there are many different factions or different fractions. You have there those who would share classical theories of conspiracy on the one hand, and on the other hand, you can see priests with a very, I would say, liberal background. But the question here is whether these hidden or overt sympathies to Russia are a product of Russian soft power, a product of intentional policy of Russia, or they can be just explained by certain ideological consonance, a certain ideological proximity between the conservative part of the Georgian society and the policy which is pursued by the Kremlin. And my answer is that the second option is will most likely lead us to in the right direction. Well, the third channel which we have looked at is think tanks and foundations, actors which are very important in shaping different discourses between Russian and Georgian counterparts. The key example here would be the Caucasian Dialogue program, which is co-managed by the Caucasian House in Tbilisi and the Gochakov Foundation as one of the most interesting example to study. And looking at the discourse which is produced by these two institutions, what I can say is that there is a common points between the two. Well, first of all, both would argue that the use of Russian hard power in 2008 was more a response to what Tbilisi has done, and that's more or less shared within this kind of framework of expert dialogue. Then there is a very clearly articulated point that Georgia could have avoided losing these territories if it would refrain from unduly irritating Kremlin. Then there is a very clear indication of the sympathies for Eurasian integration, which would treat Eurasia as a rising region, which is not confined to Russia, etc. There is a very clearly articulated skepticism. It's kind of Georgian version of Euroscepticism, which is not necessarily challenging the key premises of EU integration or something like that, but the key argument here is that this is a very utopian kind of thing to expect that Georgia might be accepted as a full-fledged member of European community. And all these points that they translate to a philosophy of kind of business as usual, which from the Russian side sometimes is added by gestures, something like, well, we do not need pro-Russian government in Tbilisi, we need pro-Georgian government in Tbilisi, which is also well articulated point. And the fourth point, the first channel of communication, the fourth channel which Russia uses, it's a set of Georgian NGOs which openly advocate for Eurasian option for this country, which includes Society of Arkady II, the Coalition Eurasian Choice Georgia, etc. Well, their discourse is more or less well known. They claim that there is a natural dependence of Georgia on Russia, that the majority of Georgians would support this option, while minority is controlled by the West. So it's a kind of combination of conspiracy theories and a very clearly articulated, clearly pronounced Russian sympathies. Just a few words about the limitation, the biggest point of Russian soft power. Well, first of all, Russian soft power is not perceived as a soft power in a classical sense. It's perceived as basically as a combination of soft power and hard power, with the domination of the later. And this is a very strong conclusion that we have drawn from interviews. Then in many of the interviews, soft power as such was perceived as an imperial concept, which would mean that Russia just plays by imperial rules with Georgia, trying to take advantage of domestic controversies, domestic fragmentation, and capitalizing on the reluctance of the West to confront Russia, which is also well known for other countries like Ukraine. And this is my final point, that in projecting its soft power on Georgia, Russia basically capitalizes on the existing Eurosceptical attitudes in these countries, on the religious beliefs, and lacks specific and workable instruments to change the Georgian society, because this is not the purpose of Russian diplomacy. And this is, of course, is very, very different from the way how soft power is being organized and projected from the part of the European Union as such. It's multiple governmental and non-governmental foundations which work in Georgia. But this is a different story. If you'd like me to make a comparison, I can also do that, but I will stop here.
Thank you, Andrey. Now we'll turn to Nona Shahnazarian from the Institute for Archaeology and Ethnography, the National Academy of Sciences of Armenia, with a wonderful presentation title. Here is not Maidan, here is Marshal Bagramyan, Understanding the Electric Yerevan.
So the more poetic than mine.
I have prepared PowerPoint presentation for you, but we could.
Do you have it?
Yes, I have.
Want to move the computer up?
So my presentation is about my memo is about electric Yerevan, so-called electric Yerevan, about nature and the force and movement of this movement in Yerevan. And let me just first map the electric Yerevan and why we call it electric Yerevan, first of all, and secondly, how the movement, the rally would move in the downtown of Yerevan. The thing is, there was decision made by Armenian government to raise electricity hike in Armenia, and it was first made for announced for 40% of that electricity hike rise, and later on, after bargaining, it was only 17%, which is still a lot, because it's common knowledge in Armenia that utility burden is very high on Armenian population. This is why all this, so it was sort of forced increase of tariff since 2009 in Yerevan. So the consequences was like young people, mostly most of the protesters were 17 35 years old. There was also some pensioners and middle-aged people, but still the core was these young people. So first, these initiatives, civic initiatives called No to Robbery. It's about maybe 100 people. They went to opera here. To opera, which is called now Liberty Square, and they initiated that sit-in rally just to fight to governmental decision. And later on, they have decided to move like this to Bagramian Avenue, where Armenian government is sitting, and so that's to ask for stopping this decision, so that to say about their demands. And in the in somewhere here, they were stopped by riot police, and actually they wanted to go further to Parliament Palace, and it was never happened because they were blocked by riot police, as I told, and actually they had not that intention to block Bagramyan Street, but actually they did. They blocked Bagramyan Street for next, let's say, week or more, and this is how the movement started. But at the same time, I have to tell just a couple of words about my method and methodology. I was just part of this movement, first of all, and secondly, I asked about 70 people. I conducted 17 in-depth interviews with participants and scholars to know their opinion on this movement. And also I had only one interview with a representative of riot police to talk about their attitude to this movement and their feelings during they performed their duty. So the nature of movement was like, it was first of all not sanctioned. Let me start with that. But still the main strategy was non-violence. And these young people, most of them, not most of them, but the core of this not to robbery initiative are young lawyers, and they were very much aware of their rights to rally and to demand. So actually, this movement's main feature for me is that it was multi-layered in sense of class configuration. So this sophisticated lace of social composition was like the most important protesters, I mean not most important, the sort of organizers of this protest. It was people, young people, who could afford themselves to pay this 7 drams increase in bills, but still they also demanded transparency accountability and accountability from their government. So the thing is, the whole movement was sort of full of obscene slogans, and it was very interesting for me as an anthropologist, because sort of after riot police was brutal to protesters. It was in the early morning. In the early morning 2013, on 23rd of June, the movement attracted quite a lot of people. So it's unprecedented number for Armenia. It's about 15,000 people. So I have only 5 minutes, unfortunately, but I will try to talk about why it is so problematic for me to call the movement Electro-Maidan, because we had a very short correspondence with Sasha Schmemann, and I was insisting that we cannot call it like that, because there was a lot of speculation on this, because there is some controversial understanding and interpretations of what is this movement about, because Russian media immediately started to speculate, and it was like absolutely the same technologies like in situation with Ukraine and Euromaidan, speculated with that this is color revolution paid by State Department, and that this is why Armenia is a traitor and will be punished, etc. So at the same time, Western media would use this this hashtag electric Yerevan, and then they just immediately go on calling it Armenian Electro-Maidan, and the idea was completely different. The idea was Armenian people, eventually they want to fight for their dignity and their dignified life and for their rights. So there was a lot of citation on that. Victoria Nuland came to Yerevan in February and brought a lot of presents like Pichenki to Armenians, and this is why this movement started. So, and they would also, it was really the peak of conspiratorial thinking, because they would also refer to the similarities in between Ukrainian Euromaidan and Armenian Electric Yerevan, talking about somebody would distribute food, and it is also made by some people who are interested to push this revolution, and that protesters would suggest food to police, and lots of this kind of stuff. Yes. So police brutality. And you know what happened during this movement? I think this carnivalization, singing and dancing, it was not new at all, even though these young people, they were absolutely sort of cut off their the other generations who would make Karabakh movement and who would go through that. And they privatized this new experience to themselves. And also what was interesting, there was this inversion of traditional values, because some of not relatives, parents would call to their children, especially to girls, saying that this is nighttime, come home, and they would answer, no, you come here. So, and also there is another photo here that shows that, unfortunately I missed it, I think, that shows that women would young girls would dance very, very militaristic, but also very boyish dance, which is called Bert. So this is just one of the results, but the result also was like there was lots of manipulations during this movement, especially from the side of government. What was puzzling for me that there was first brutality, harsh brutality of police in the early morning on June 23rd, and then government and governmental people and police became very, very kind to protesters, and also they apologized for what they did, and they immediately released people, 25 young people whom they arrested that night. What is interesting, my idea is maybe there was some pressure from Armenian diaspora, Western diaspora. I have no idea, I just guess. But still, I would call that this is really a great start. Last 20 years I had no chance to be optimistic, but I am now optimistic. But still, I would say that this movement, not maybe because they announced in the beginning their apolitical stance, and I can explain why they did that, because of this very low trust to any political actors, to any even oppositional, that means systemic opposition parties that would try to instrumentally use any movement for their political agenda. And this is why they did this, but at the same time they had no this coordinatory or this strategies how to act, because when they were invited to presidential house for negotiation, they refused because first of all they didn't want to recognize that there is some leaders, because they already announced that the movement is leaderless, and secondly they were puzzled how to negotiate, especially because they have only one demand: stop this tariff increase. Yes. So I have so much to say, but I have to come to a conclusion. So my conclusion is the whole movement unfortunately failed, because after President announced his statement on June 27 that the government is going to suspend this increase in tariff, and Later on, the professional European or internationally recognized audit or consulting firms will conduct audit and to come to conclusion if this electricity hike is objective and really needed. So also so that to save their face in front of Russian counterparts, government announced that it's going to pay all this money to Russian company until the audit finished its work. And also the sort of step to protesters was that they some of them will be invited to be part of that commission. Still the increase was not cancelled, and moreover, Bagramyan, Prime Minister, announced that for these advantaged families, government is going to give 2,000 Armenian drams, which is $4 American, so that to support them to pay this increase, this money in future. So what was really frustrating, that government was taking money from the budget, and more than that, government was very manipulative, saying to these young people and to whole society as a punishment that the money is going to be taken from security money. And at this point I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of our panelists. We have plenty of time for discussion. I mean, I just have 2 points I want to raise before we open it up for discussion to consider. One is, I'm struck listening to all